Hello, and welcome to another Institute for Sound Public Policy podcast. Today is November 11th, 2024, and I am your host, Kevin Lynn. I'm also the executive director of the Institute, as well as the founder of U.S. Tech Workers. And when it comes to immigration, many of our listeners know us for what we've been doing in the realm of legal immigration and looking at employment visa programs that have been used over the last several decades to displace American white-collar workers. However, tonight we're going to spend all of our time talking about illegal immigration. And in particular, what are we going to do with the millions of illegal aliens who've entered the country during the Biden administration, in which, it was pretty much just chaos at the borders with a complete breakdown in enforcement. And also illegal immigrations from prior administrations. So here to help me unravel this and get into the nuts and bolts of not only what do we do, but how do we do it? Because at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have a lot of deportations. And I think if we're going to be serious about this, we're going to have to look at the possibility of removing as many as 30 million people. So to help me understand the nuts and the bolts and how we go about doing that, I have a fantastic guest. He goes by the moniker Hart Seller on social media, and there's probably no one more fluent in immigration statutes and enforcement than Hart is out there. So, Hart, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Kevin. I really appreciate it.
Great. Well, you're looking rather dapper this evening.
Indeed, I am. I'm trying to get into fighting shape, arresting, deporting shape.
There we go. Hart, this is really what we're going to be talking about is very serious. There's been a lot of hyperbole about it on both sides. And I think it's important to note that this isn't the first time the country has been faced with having to do mass deportations. In 1952, for instance, the country deported up to a little over 700,000 people in 1 year. So it's not like it's something new, but certainly these numbers are pretty incredible. So, Hart, what do we begin with to wrap our heads around how to solve this problem and how to remove the people that really, as Barbara Jordan aptly stated, people who should get in, and those that shouldn't, don't? How do we get rid of all those people that shouldn't be here in the first place?
Well, so it's Veterans Day, so this seems like sort of an apt analogy, but, in the military, they teach you the first thing to do is stop the bleeding. So the first thing that we really need to do is when the Trump administration comes into office is absolutely clamp down on illegal entries, because we don't need anymore. We have our work cut out for us. And after, the Biden-Harris administration's 3 years, by that point, 4 years of unrivaled border crossings, we just can't afford to continue to allow people coming in at the rates that they have been. And when you compare this administration to the first iteration of the Trump administration, the numbers are vastly, vastly different. So there was in the beginning of the Trump administration, there was what was known among illegal immigrants as essentially the Trump effect. They were scared of Trump, so a lot of them didn't want to come. And once he, wasn't in office anymore, and candidate Biden had said, you should surge the border, they took him up on it.
Absolutely right. I recall when I was down on the border 2 summers ago, I was speaking with several National Guardsmen, and they had informed me that when the Remain in Mexico was implemented, I believe was it 2019 or 18, Hart? I forget. It all gets blurry after a while. But when it was implemented, it was amazing just knowing that that a program like that was in effect. All of a sudden, the people that were being apprehended on this side of the border just it was a wave, but then it dropped to a trickle to almost nothing. So enforcement does work on many different levels.
Yeah, so that the Remain in Mexico policy launched in January of 2019. And the thing to keep in mind about it is that it only applied to people who were ostensibly asylum seekers, quote unquote, which really is not that many people. So, Remain in Mexico didn't even have nearly the effect on people coming that most Americans probably believe. They sort of clamored during the early days of the Biden administration to keep the Remain in Mexico program, or the Migrant Protection Protocols, as they're officially known. But again, because it was something for asylum seekers, there weren't that many people enrolled in it. But it's a part of an existing statute. So, as long as Mexico were presumably amenable to it, we could literally send anybody to wait in Mexico, whether or not they were asylum seekers. But there are other better statutes than Remain in Mexico that apply to the vast majority of people coming who aren't asylum seekers.
Well, that's great. That's why I'll tell you, Hart, I am so glad you're on tonight because I know we're going to get into the statutes. So let's maybe start with more of a broad brush. Why don't can you begin to describe what an illegal alien is? Because there's all kinds of definitions out there. There's illegal alien. People don't like to use that, so they want to say undocumented. But then there's terms like admissibility, inadmissibility. Do you want to begin to break all that down for our audience, Hart?
Yeah, so I've got some slides here if you want to
Sure,
throw
I'll
them
go
up on
ahead
the
and
screen
bring
for the
up the.
audience.
Great, I'll bring up the first one now.
All right, so and this breaks down illegal immigration probably to its simplest form. There's border crossers, and that those are aliens who enter the United States between ports of entry. Just plain and simple, vanilla illegal immigration. The other half of our illegal immigration population are people who came here legally and then overstayed. Now, you can come legally through a land port of entry, at a seaport, but most of them come through international airports. And so these are the only two ways that you can be an illegal immigrant in the United States. Now, if you cross the border, if it's your first offense, there's a five year statute of limitations on that criminal offense. So that means that 5 years and a day, I can't prosecute you for it. You're just simply here illegally. And being here in the United States illegally is not actually a crime. Now, illegal immigrants routinely commit crimes in furtherance of being able to stay in the United States, but being here illegally isn't a crime. On the other side of the spectrum, visa overstaying at the outset is a civil offense, and therefore it has no statute of limitations. And again, being here illegally isn't a crime, it's a civil offense. So in both of these instances, deportation is the specified outcome for being here illegally. That is the objective of the government, is to deport people. And deportation is not a punishment. So the Supreme Court, going back to like the 1880s or 1890s, has repeatedly specified that deportation is a consequence, not a punishment. So that goes back to statutes of limitations and crimes. So if you're not committing a crime, we can't punish you, but we can return you, because that's the consequence associated with you being here illegally.
Okay. So at the end of the day, everyone in here who crossed the border illegally or has overstayed their visa is can be removed by deportation.
Exactly right, and that is the congressionally specified outcome for being in the United States illegally.
Now, why is it, Hart, that we keep getting hung up on the process of doing this? Why do there seem to be so many roadblocks just to doing what should be commonsensical? Like you're here illegally, you've been apprehended. Why aren't you being deported? What is going on?
I mean, so some of this is like the divergence in the American people. You have, a segment of the population that doesn't believe anybody's illegal, referring to the person or the action. We shouldn't have any sort of restrictions on who comes here, under what circumstances. They should be able to come here however they please, whenever they please, in whatever quantities they please. And then you have the other side of the American population who's like, well, we have restrictions, and we should vet people, and illegal immigration bad and legal immigration good. And we could literally have an entire episode dedicated to whether or not legal immigration is good, especially in the quantities that we currently have it. But for today's purposes, we're literally only talking about illegal immigration. But in people's minds, they just sort of have both sides have sort of a glamorous idea of immigration into the United States. People on the right are like, you don't call them immigrants if they came here illegally, because that's not an immigrant. But that's not what the law says. According to US code, you can be here illegally and still be an immigrant. There's only like a really small group of aliens who would be exempt from being defined as an immigrant, and everybody else is an immigrant, whether you
Mm-hmm.
came legally or came illegally, or are here legally or illegally. You are an immigrant in the eyes of the US government.
And what are the statutes that all of this rests upon? Obviously, we had immigration acts throughout our history, but what defines what it is that allows someone to come here legally versus illegally?
Well, so all of our immigration laws are bound together in one group of laws. So in government vernacular, they're known as titles. So each set of laws, each title refers to some different function of government. And so all of our immigration laws are Title 8. And so that's where I get my online handle from. 8 USC 12 is what's known as the short code for our immigration laws. So illegal entry is 8 USC 1325. If you get deported and come back, that's 8 USC 1326. The definition of an alien is 8 USC 1101 A3. So each one of those laws covers some separate portion of immigration to the United States, be it legal or illegal.
Great. So the nuts and bolts now. I mean, we're looking at the potential of having to remove a lot of people. So I'm really anxious to kind of dive into how do we do this, Hart?
Well, it's kind of like the adage about how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time. The same thing applies here. It's not going to be pretty, and there's going to be a lot of people that put up a fuss about it. But at the end of the day, it comes down to this. As in my case, as somebody that enforces U.S. law, I don't make policy, I enforce it. So if Congress were to decide tomorrow that they didn't want, the illegal entry statute, for instance, if they repeal that law, then I would enforce whatever replaced it, or nothing at all, if that was, whatever the case may be. But Congress, multiple successive Congresses, have specified that we have immigration laws. people should come here legally, what constitutes coming here legally, whether or not somebody, as you mentioned before, admissibility, whether or not somebody can be admitted into the country. And if they can't be, they're not supposed to be allowed to enter the country. But as we've seen with this administration, there are countless millions of people that have been allowed to enter even though they were not legally admitted. And so that's how we do mass deportations, is basically going to be the reverse of what this administration has done for letting people, immigrate to the United States through really questionably legal means.
Great. And Hart, what's the process ultimately for getting this all done?
Well, so there's a lot of, there's been a lot of talk in, the sort of the tail end of the last administration and the entirety of this administration, and in particular, the twice failed Senate border bill that was negotiated by Republican Senator James Lankford, Democratic caucusing independent Kristen Sinema, and Democratic Senator Chris Murphy. And that is that, some people believe that we need new laws, but in truth be told, we have almost all the laws that we need on the books now. Some could definitely be improved. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying our current system is perfect. But when it comes to enforcement of the law, and in this case, deportations, and at scale, a lot of the laws that we already have work just fine if they would actually be enforced. And some of them actually go back, easily into the 1950s. But so we're talking about, how do we treat people that shouldn't be here humanitarily while also showing them the door? And so the answer to that is due process as is applicable. So let's look at another one of the slides.
Okay.
All right.
I just brought up your due process slide.
Excellent. So, all right. So this is basically a quote from a 1950s Supreme Court case. So the Supreme Court case was called Knopf versus Shaughnessy. So the plaintiff was a woman that was detained at Ellis Island, and she was deemed somebody that could not be admitted into the United States. And she sued, arguing that her detention was a violation of her due process rights. And so what the Supreme Court found is, and I quote, whatever the procedures authorized by Congress, it is due process. And so I've ended the quote there, and I've clarified for the audience that obviously doesn't have quite the same level of familiarity with immigration law, for aliens who haven't been admitted into the United States. So now remember, I said that if you are, certain groups of people cannot be admitted into the United States. And if you enter illegally, you are inadmissible. So you chose to enter illegally, thereby making it impossible for us to legally admit you. So let's go to the next slide.
Right on. I'll do that. Let me move that forward here. Okay. I love this slide.
Yeah, so I basically created a table to explain due process. So in the first column, we have no due process, and I have an asterisk there, and the asterisk represents an exception to the rule. So in all of these cases, but specifically this first column, is the exception to the rule is seeking asylum. So any alien under, generally speaking, any circumstances can either outright say, I want asylum, or they can tell an immigration officer that they fear being persecuted if they're deported from the United States. Now, that being said, for the last fiscal year, and the full year's data hasn't been released yet. It only goes through June at this point. Less than 7% of all aliens encountered anywhere in the United States. So that's the southwestern border, the northern border, the coastal borders along both coasts of the United States, and at international airports anywhere inside the United States. Less than 7% of all of those aliens encountered through June either requested asylum or expressed a fear of persecution if they were deported. Now, the last fiscal year before that, FY23, the full year's data is available, and that shows that less than 6% of every alien that was encountered for the entirety of the fiscal year sought asylum through either of those two means I just
Right,
mentioned.
because
So,
I think it's important, Hart, that our audience understand that asylum is, to use a metaphor, it's a lifeboat. You're this is your only way to preserve your life is to get into this lifeboat, and that's what asylum is supposed to be. And it's been really abused, I think, in terms of certainly how it's been bantied around by the Biden administration and in the press. But with those numbers are so small, it really speaks to, yes, very few people are truly in danger of, you know, life and death, or they could be killed if they return to their country of origin and have to remain here. The vast, vast majority are, in fact, economic migrants. And there's a whole, we won't get into it, but there's a whole host of technicalities there, like, you need to be, the next safe country is the one you go to. You don't just make a beeline to the United States. And so, but yeah, it's amazing, Hart, that the press has gaslit the American public to think that so many of these people coming here are somehow in fear of their lives.
yeah, and it's funny because, as of today, the incoming Trump 47 administration has named Thomas Homan, who had been most recently an acting director of ICE under the prior Trump administration, and before that was essentially the assistant director for enforcement and removal operations, and before that, was a senior executive in that section of ICE. That he's going to be the quote unquote border czar for the incoming administration. So people are basically reposting video clips of him testifying during the Trump administration in a really contentious back and forth with AOC, where she's talking about, he's talking about illegal entries, and she's like, they're not breaking any laws, seeking asylum is legal. And that's where the two sides just completely branch off, because seeking asylum is legal. Entering the United States anywhere other than a port of entry is illegal. And the two are disparate. You can be prosecuted for entering illegally because you committed a crime, and before you get deported, you can say, oh yeah, I want asylum, or I'm afraid someone will hurt me if you deport me. But you're exactly right, because at the end of the day, asylum is a humanitarian benefit that the U.S. government may, but frankly rarely does, give out to people. So there is asylum abuse going on. It's just nowhere near the scale that I think the American people believe, because they don't know any better through no fault of their own. And you have an administration that goes on TV on the regular and says, well, these are asylum seekers and we have to let them, blah, blah, blah. And then you have a friendly media that basically repeats that talking point and never investigates the claim, or they only go to immigration attorneys who are like, yeah, these are asylum seekers.
Oh boy. Well, hey, I want to keep going on due process, Hart, because we could jump down so many rabbit holes here. Okay,
Indeed.
I'll pull up the presentation again.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, so getting back to it. So no due process. So these individuals, now that I've explained the asylum escape hatch, don't have due process for whatever reasons. So the first one is VWP, and that stands for the Visa Waiver Program. So there are countries with whom we have an international agreement where we don't require their nationals to have a visa to come to the United States, and they don't require Americans to have visas to go to their country. And so there are about 31 countries, I think it is, that have that are Visa Waiver Program participants. So in our case, if you come to the U.S. as a VWP, you are only allowed to come for 90 days. And if you overstay, you signed away your rights to see an immigration judge. So if you didn't know that when you got here, ignorance of the law is not supposed to be an excuse. So I'll give you an example. So Anna Delvey, the woman who pretended to be like a German aristocrat to make friends with rich people in like New York and Connecticut, etc., and then fleece them of their money. She's currently in deportation proceedings, but she entered the United States from Germany as a visa waiver program overstay. So the Biden administration was within its rights to pick her up from jail, which they did, but then promptly deport her, which they did not. Instead, they issued her a notice to appear in immigration court, gave her an ankle monitor, and now she's living in like a penthouse in New York City. But she is an example of somebody that should not be here because she doesn't have a right to due process. But of course, they gave her some. The next one is border crossers. So there is a concept in immigration law called expedited removal. Expedited removal allows a border patrol agent or a officer from the Office of Field Operations, which is the CBP component that operates ports of entry, to deport an alien without referral to an immigration judge, provided they aren't seeking asylum, if they're encountered within 2 years of being in the United States. Now, that law stems from 1996 during the Clinton administration. And so when it was introduced, the statute has no geographical limitations. Its only limitations is effectively 2 years. And it's actually, if you read the statute, it's 2 years to the satisfaction of an immigration officer. So
Okay.
even then, it could be more than two, but we'll just keep it simple at 2 years. So when the law was introduced as a regulation, so basically Congress passes laws, and then the executive branch takes that law, writes a regulation about how a law will be enforced, and then starts to do so. So the regulation governing expedited removal limited it to within 100 miles of a external boundary of the United States. So in this case, primarily the U.S.-Mexico border.
Mm-hmm.
And then in during the George W. Bush administration, that was expanded to, it was limited to within 14 days of the external boundary. But during the Trump administration, now incoming President Trump, I mean, is had during his last administration said, hey, well, this is, why are we not using this law the way that Congress intended to its full effect within 2 years, and then deporting people that don't need to be referred to an immigration judge. And so there were lawsuits, and actually this particular lawsuit involving expedited removal was actually heard by none other than Judge Brown Jackson. Sorry, give me 1 second here. All right, let's see here. So Judge Brown Jackson. So that case was actually won by the government. And what they determined is that the statute is clear in its meaning. And so therefore the regulations about it were written in such a way that whoever the now DHS secretary is can change how the law is used and does not need to post a public notice to warn people. They can just say, from here on out, we're going to start using expedited removal anywhere in the United States. So then it becomes a tool where it's not just limited to Border Patrol agents and OFO officers. It can actually be used by ICE officers and ICE agents. All they have to do is just start arresting people. The next one is parolees. So a lot of what this administration has been doing as a way to sort of tickle the illegal entry numbers, if you will, is to grant parole to aliens. Now, it had done a lot of paroling in, like, aliens would enter illegally, and this administration would just give them parole and then release them to the United States. But that wasn't actually getting the job done. the numbers were still way too high. So what it did was it started creating parole programs. So first it was the Uniting for Ukraine program, then it became the CHNV program, then there was another program called the FRP program, there's another program called the Central American Minors Program, which was actually one that had been started by the Obama administration and then was terminated by the Trump administration. They had brought back. So what this does is this allows an alien who is inadmissible to enter the United States initially for a period of 2 years and then renewable thereafter. You can parole somebody for less time than that, but this administration's been doing 2 years at a hitch. So a parolee who has been here less than 2 years, if their parole expires, again, no due process. They revert to what they were before, which is, in legal speak, an alien seeking admission. And again,
So when the parole ends, technically they should leave.
Yes, they should leave, but if they choose not to, they revert to being someone that is trying to seek admission to the United States, even though they're technically physically already here. They're not legally here.
Okay.
All right, the next one is prior deportee. So if you've been previously deported and you return to the United States, you do not get to see an immigration judge. What happens is called reinstatement. So you have a prior deportation order, that order is reinstated, and you just simply get deported again. Now, there are instances of aliens fighting reinstatement, but it's time consuming and sort of complicated, and there are only really narrow abilities for an alien to utilize that, and it usually has to be with some sort of defect of the initial deportation. And then finally is outstanding deportation orders. So during the Trump administration, there were something like 1.7 million outstanding orders of deportation, and that was actually only for Mexicans and aliens from the Northern Triangle, so El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Mm-hmm. Now, I've seen people that have been talking about 1.3 million orders,
but I've heard 1.5 million at this point. Right.
Yeah, and so, but the whole thing is that I'm pretty certain that it's actually more. It's probably well over 2 million, because the problem is that most deportation proceedings, like the case, are not custodial, so the alien is free to go. So even if they attend all their hearings, which can, in some cases, can take years, mm-hmm. in addition to taking years before you even initially see a judge, the judge is going to tell you that you've been ordered deported, but no one is going to take you into custody right then and there. You're going to receive a letter in the mail. So once that letter comes, and the letter is known as a bag and baggage letter, and it tells you basically to report to your local ICE office with a bag so that you can be deported. But it's known colloquially within immigration enforcement as a run letter, because you get the notice in the mail, ICE is looking for you, you run. So that's the whole thing, is that we have so many orders of deportation that are outstanding because we don't take people into custody then and there. And so all of these deportation orders are essentially just stacking up. We may periodically deport somebody, but it's usually because they've done something else. So even if we, go on the Pollyanna-ish view that most of these people aren't criminals, they're not really bothering anybody, that's not really accurate to begin with. But if you ignore a deportation order, that is actually a crime. So even if you came here on a visa and were admitted and then overstayed, and neither of those two things are crimes, if you get put into deportation proceedings and then you're ordered deported and don't leave, now you're a criminal. And on top of that, you're a criminal.
The Jean-Claude Pepper, the movie Green Card, where at the end he had overstayed his visa. He was trying to do a sham marriage to stay in the States, and at the end he gets deported.
Yes, that is exactly right. So, you're ordered deported. You are breaking the law by basically either refusing or failing to depart, and then on top of it, you're a fugitive. So, all right. So in
Right.
column two,
We'll refer to that as the low hanging fruit going forward.
there you go. And so switching to column two, now we're talking about people who receive limited due process. And the viewer should think back to that quote from the Supreme Court. So now we're talking about visa overstays. So you overstayed, and for some reason you came to the attention of immigration officials. So you're put into deportation proceedings, and you can fight. Now, again, because it's a civil action, you can hire an attorney, but that attorney is not court appointed, and there can be no cost to taxpayers. Now, of course, various administrations have gotten around this by doing things like giving out block grants to
Right. To
NGOs.
NGOs that hire attorneys that help people with these kind of proceedings.
Exactly. So there's a tip for the Trump 47 administration: cut off the block grants, cut off the attorneys. Um, so next is border crossers who have been present for more than 2 years. So they can't be expeditiously removed like the other group of border crossers. So again, they have to be put into deportation proceedings. And then the next group is parolees who have been here for more than 2 years. Same thing, they have to go through the formal deportation process. And then the last in this column is unaccompanied alien children, or UACs. So UACs, we have a extremely large and ever increasing problem with UACs coming to this country. So it was bad during the Trump administration. It was bad during the Obama administration. It was bad through the W. Bush administration. It's basically been bad going back to the Reagan administration, but each administration it just seems to get exponentially worse. So during the Obama administration, less than half of children were actually deported, even if they were ordered deported. And so during this administration, not only are children not getting deported, but there are instances where ICE can't find a whole bunch of them.
Well, it's
And
rumored. Hard. You probably know this number better than I do, but there's over 300,000 unaccompanied children that are unaccounted for.
it's actually closer to 500, because that
Wow.
that 321,000, the OIG report says that it was from children that were apprehended, or I'm sorry, children that were encountered between 2019 and June of 2023. But if you just look at just the Biden Harris numbers alone, it's 400,000 some odd children during their administration alone. So we're actually, if we combine that, that almost 500,000 with those from 2019 through 2021, that's probably still another 250,000. So we may actually be now into 750,000 territory.
Those are absolutely staggering numbers.
Oh, yeah. And so the whole thing is that, so Congress passed a law where children that are encountered as unaccompanied are basically treated as if they're asylum seekers, and also provided they aren't Mexican or Canadian children who can be promptly just returned to
Mm-hmm.
their country of origin, we have to screen children from any of the other countries that they might be encountered from, to ensure that they are not victims of trafficking. But the problem is that the law doesn't actually say much beyond that, and so it's subject to interpretation. So there's really not anything that would stop us from basically putting children through expedited proceedings in order to repatriate them. But instead, what happens is the children get released, so they're in the custody of Customs and Border Protection. They're transferred from CBP by ICE to Health and Human Services, where they stay in a facility for children until they can be placed with a quote unquote sponsor. Now, in the
Right.
old days, sponsors were in more than half of instances either a parent who was already illegally in the United States, or somebody fronting for the parent, like a friend of the family, but would just turn the kid over after they were released to the parent. These days, in a lot of instances, have no idea who the sponsor is. And worse, the children don't either. So that needs to be something that the Trump administration leans very heavily into, is finding the children so that we can repatriate them to their countries of origin.
Fantastic. Well, it's, I mean, we need to, but I think our audience right now should be getting a feel for the huge challenge this had become. I mean, again, we're looking at these numbers over, roughly 10 million people in the course of 4 years, and that's at the end of the day, that's an estimate.
Yes, a really really significant. So we'll talk numbers here in a couple slides, but let's finish the full due process column. Okay, so the last column is people that receive full due process, and even that is sort of limited because we're talking about immigration proceedings, which again aren't criminal, but this would be green card holders and naturalized U.S. citizens. So green card holders are treated differently than somebody that is a non-immigrant or someone who is an illegal immigrant. So if you are a green card holder and you commit a crime, your crime may or may not make you deportable. And if it does, then the first thing that has to happen is you basically have to be stripped of your green card and then deported. So we don't deport green card holders, but we can deport aliens who were green card holders. And the same thing for naturalized citizens. So there is both a criminal and a civil process whereby we can take citizenship from people if their citizenship was illegally procured. And so that happens either by a falsification or a misrepresentation of a material fact, something that the alien has done that would cause an examiner from USCIS not to grant naturalization. And so during the Trump administration, there was a emphasis put on denaturalizations. And of course, the progressive left was like, oh, they're trying to deport people who are citizens, completely ignoring the fact that in a lot of cases these people were people who had done something and shouldn't have received citizenship in the first place. To them, it's a game. If you manage to get citizenship, then you should be able to keep it. It doesn't matter what you actually did. But the truth of the matter is that the denaturalization effort that the Trump administration undertook, it inherited from the Obama administration. And a lot of those people were actually, so going back even as far as the Clinton administration, there were people who had, in a lot of cases, sought asylum and been denied, but then turned around and changed their name and applied for asylum again, using what they learned the first time to actually get asylum. And once you get asylum, then after a year, you can apply for a green card, and then after 5 years, you can apply for citizenship. Well, back then, we didn't have digital fingerprinting like we do now. So there were literally hallways that had stacks and stacks of boxes of fingerprint cards. So the Obama administration was like, okay, well, technology has come far enough now that we need to start scanning these and put them into the system. Well, what they started discovering was that you might have somebody who applied for asylum under one name whose fingerprints actually matched somebody with another name. So they started a pilot program that was known back then as Operation Janus. So the god with two faces.
Mm-hmm.
And then after a while, they changed the name to Operation Second Look. And there was like an entire office that was opened in California whose sole job it was to track down these people that had fraudulently obtained citizenship by gaming the asylum system, which back then...
My gosh, Hart, you're talking as if we actually did enforcement at one time in this country.
I know. It's like hilarious, I know.
Do you want to now? Do you want to describe what full due process is?
Yeah, so full due process, in all honesty, isn't really that much different than limited due process.
Okay,
It's
that's
just
what I
that
thought.
who the people are, because people get upset when you talk about the middle column being potentially deported. But when you start talking about people on the right column, green card holders who, in theory, are people who will eventually become U.S. citizens, even though there's no obligation to do so, and a lot of green card holders don't, and then naturalized citizens. So I titled the column as full due process just to reflect the fact that you can't treat those people the same way that you can treat somebody in either the first or second column, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So, like,
Absolutely.
for instance, if you are a U.S. citizen and you return to the United States, let's say you don't have a passport, well, we can't turn you away under any circumstances. We can detain you long enough to establish that you are, in fact, a U.S. citizen. You are Kevin Lynn. But if you were Kevin Lynn green card holder instead, we still could not necessarily turn you away, even if you had, committed a crime overseas or committed a crime here or had ostensibly abandoned your lawful permanent residence by living abroad for more than 6 months without permission. So you would still be taken into custody and you would be processed for removal proceedings, for deportation, but we would still let you back in because you're a green card holder.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I chose to call that column full, quote unquote, full due process.
Thanks for that. I appreciate that. Great. Well, moving on, Hart. Let's get into the meat of this.
All
That's
right.
great
So,
background. That is fantastic background. And for the uninitiated, I think this has got, the build. That's a great building block to help them better understand what actually the deportation proceedings are going to require.
yeah. So now if we go to the next slide, and I gave a little bit of a preview of the next slide.
Okay, there we go.
Okay, so I talked a little bit about expedited removal, which is 8 U.S.C. 1225B. So it basically has two components, and then there is a related one. So I'll do the related one first. So
Mm-hmm.
certain aliens who commit aggravated felonies, which are generally like the worst kinds of criminal offenses, are subject to being detained and can actually be deported quicker than somebody that would, say, commit a less offensive crime. So
Like
let's say,
Jose Ibarra, who killed Laken Riley, who's being tried for murder now. That would be an example of an aggravated felon.
exactly right. And so Georgia could actually request, well, not this administration, even though they do say they would, actually remove violent criminals. But so the Georgia could ask the incoming Trump administration, once they're in office, to expeditiously deport Ibarra after he's, been tried by Georgia and hopefully is convicted of her murder. And if he doesn't get life, which I don't believe the prosecutors were going for, but I might be confusing that with some other,
Right.
unfortunately,
There's been a couple
unnecessary.
dozen.
Yeah, so with some other unnecessarily murdered American. But so that's aggravated felonies, and so I have the statute for that. So that's 8 USC 1228. But so 1225s are the two lower circles. So again, as I said before, aliens caught within 100 miles of a border and within 14 days. And again, I said that is a
They
regulation.
don't have to appear before a judge. There's no hearing. Just deport them
May
straight
may
away.
may, may not. So they may not be, they do not have to be referred to an immigration judge. So I was very frustrated recently on a trip out to a southwestern border sector, which shall remain nameless, where a sector chief told me that he had been for years releasing aliens because they said they wanted to see an immigration judge. And when I asked about seeking asylum, he was like, "No, they just said they wanted to see an immigration judge." Well, that's not acceptable. The law says shall be shall be like, shall be detained and does not need to be referred to an immigration judge. So that means that unless you're telling me that you want asylum or you're afraid someone will hurt you, I, as a Border Patrol agent, should be able to simply do the paperwork, have my supervisor sign off on it, and you are either, if you're Mexican, you're just turned back to the nearest port of entry to be Mexico's problem, or if you're from some other country, transferred to ICE, and ICE gets you travel paperwork, and then you're deported from there. But at any rate, what the Biden-Harris administration under Alejandro Mayorkas has been doing is intentionally trying to break the immigration court system by releasing aliens who I said before aren't asylum
You mean
seekers.
just to overwhelm the system, you're
Yes,
thinking?
to permanently break it and then necessitate mass amnesty.
My God. Yeah, that I mean, all roads really do lead to just that as an
Yeah, because
intention.
at the end of the Trump administration, I want to say there were maybe like 1.2 million outstanding immigration cases. And there were some shenanigans during the Obama administration we won't get into, but let's just go with, 1.7. So the last I looked for the Biden Harris administration, including some of the Trump administration cases, were now closer to 4 million deportation cases. But oddly enough, only like 1.25, 1.5 of them maybe involve asylum. So again, if people take nothing away from this talk we're having, again, it's that the vast majority of people that are coming are not asylum seekers.
My gosh. All right. Well, back at it.
Okay, and so the final piece of this trifecta is aliens misrepresenting or without immigration papers. So there's a little bit of overlap because if you enter the U.S. illegally, chances are you probably don't have immigration paperwork. But these days, it's also in vogue for aliens to throw it away. But that third circle is really representative of what happens at ports of entry. So if you go to a port of entry, even if you say, I want asylum, even if you had a passport with a visa in it, you've now officially made yourself inadmissible. Like coming into, excuse me, sorry. Like coming to seek asylum is not grounds for being admitted into the U.S. So you could have told a consular officer you wanted to go to Disney World, but as soon as you present at a port of entry, as soon as you tell an officer, I'm here for asylum, you're inadmissible. They're still obligated to process you for asylum, but you'll never be admitted because you've made yourself inadmissible. And misrepresenting can be anything from, um, committing fraud to, primarily committing fraud, but other grounds of inadmissibility. So let's say, if you present with a passport that doesn't belong to you, that's a clear instance where you have misrepresented. But let's say you go to the immigration checkpoint at a port of entry and the officer asks you why you're coming to the United States, well, if you initially say that you're going to Disney World, but then when they ask you more questions, you basically say that you're coming for work, then you've again misrepresented. So, if you were inadmissible per 8 USC 1182 A6C, which is misrepresentation,
Mm-hmm.
or 7B, which is not having immigration documents, like not having a visa, you're subject to expedited removal. So all three of these require that the alien be detained. And so even if you're an asylum seeker, you're still counted towards expedited removal, but you're temporarily removed from that process so that you can pursue asylum. However, the expedited removal statute says in it in 3 separate places that aliens shall be detained, and they mean through the duration of your immigration proceedings. Now, the one of the things that Texas tried to do to defend itself against the Biden-Harris administration very early was to sue over it not detaining aliens. And as much as people on the far left like to talk about the conservative Supreme Court, the questionably right-leaning Supreme Court basically said, well, yeah, the statute does say shall be detained, but we don't have enough beds for everybody coming, and we never have. So therefore, the administration isn't actually obligated to detain everybody, even though that was very clearly Congress's intent.
Gotcha. Wow. So, moving along, this is great. And then I love what you've done here. This is something you probably don't have to go through, but ladies and gentlemen, you can refer to this and the particular statutes for each of these, if you want to call them crimes, misdemeanors, civic violations. You've laid that out very nicely.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. Yeah, so people can basically see this envisions that an alien is seeking asylum, and it basically lays out, as you said, the various statutes that would be applicable, starting from an illegal entry, if that is how they got into the United States, all the way down to appealing a negative finding for their asylum case, and then everything in between. But before we go to the next slide, I do want to touch on the second to last row. And so one of the things that we heard about why we needed the Senate border bill was to streamline the asylum process. But I said in the beginning that almost everything that we need as a tool already exists. And so that line is representative of it. So under existing law, an alien is to be and I just realized that. Yeah, so they have to have filed for asylum, and within 45 days, actually the line above that, they have to have had their first hearing, and then their case is supposed to be decided in 180 days. Now, the Senate border bill actually presumed that everybody coming was an asylum seeker, which of course I've already debunked, but also it made their proceedings non-custodial. It said that they would be streamlined and expedited, but if you say you want asylum, or I just assume that you're an asylum seeker and I release you from custody, then it's not really incumbent on you to come back unless you actually want asylum, which even most of the people that say they do don't. So it was a joke, and it was a scam, and it was duplicative of existing statutes that we already don't enforce. But all right, let's
okay.
let's go on to the next slide.
That bill went down the way it did. All right.
Oh, believe me too.
Okay, let me see. Did I get? Yeah, there we go. Here we're getting into the numbers now. And I think this is really important because these are the assets that will be used. These are the resources our government has available to it.
All right. So we got the next slide.
Okay, did I hit the right one? No, there we go. That's the next slide.
All right. It hasn't come up for me yet.
Oh, one moment. Let me double. Oh, here we go. I think. Let me see. Technical glitch here. Going back. Come on, where is you? There we go. Oh, I see. Here we go. That was my fault. I apologize. I'm going to go ahead and pull that out again. There we go. Can you see it now?
Perfect. Yes, I can. Okay. So, ICE handles the Immigrations and Customs Enforcement arm of DHS, is responsible ultimately for deporting anybody who is not Canadian or Mexican. So the Border Patrol can essentially, and we won't get into the various nuances of what constitutes a deportation, but if you're Canadian or Mexican and you interact with either the Border Patrol or the Office of Field Operations at a port of entry, they can send you back to whichever of those countries you're from. They don't need ICE for it. But if you're from some other country other than Canada or Mexico, you're going to be turned over to ICE. So ICE primarily conducts deportations using its Office of Enforcement and Removal Operations, or ERO for short. So there are approximately 6,000 ERO officers. So that is an individual who is sworn with arrest authority who can arrest an alien for a violation of U.S. immigration law. Now, ICE has a second section that is known as Homeland Security Investigations, and there are 6,500 of those individuals. Those individuals are actually special agents. So ERO has officers and HSI has agents. Agents are responsible for conducting investigations of violations which don't necessarily have to involve immigration, and in fact they often don't. So for instance, every year at the Super Bowl, if you look on social media, you'll find examples of HSI talking about how they're doing, they're looking for smuggled jerseys from the two teams, or fake championship rings. They'll also do like sex crimes investigations involving like trafficking of women and children for attendees of the game. Those kinds of things. They do gang investigations. But so anything that is an investigation is handled by HSI, and anything that is just simply enforcement is ERO. So
Now,
now
question: Can
yes.
HSI actually do deportations themselves? Can they get involved in the arrest of?
Yeah, they can do the arrests, but they wouldn't do the actual deportation. They would, like, let's say they're doing a gang investigation involving MS-13 or Trans-Aragua, the Venezuelan gang that's become like a household name in these last 2 or 3 years. If they make arrests involving aliens, they would process those aliens and they would turn them over to ERO, who would be responsible for detaining them and getting travel paperwork. It's easy, would be easier said than done in the case of Venezuela. But like, let's say MS-13, who is from El Salvador, we wouldn't have problems getting paperwork to return Salvadoreños to El Salvador.
Gotcha. Now, my question is with regard to those numbers, the 6,000 and 6,500. Are those actual personnel, or just the billets, as many as 6,000 or as many as 6,500?
So that is the billets, or in civilian government, the FTEs, the full-time equivalents. So yes, the positions. So I haven't seen recent numbers for how many officers and agents we have, but I imagine it's quite a bit lower, because at least in the case of ERO, the men and women of ERO, they want to enforce immigration laws. That's what they signed up for. So if they can't deport people, they're kind of going to lose motivation. And
Right,
if we look
because
at the
haven't many over the past 3 years and 8 months, haven't they really been put on all the duties, and with regard to processing and not arresting and not deporting, but processing illegal immigrants?
Yeah, they have been called up to go down and assist the border patrol and the Office of Field Operations, essentially processing people, taking care of children, driving vans, those kind of things, rather than actually going out, conducting a targeted enforcement. So like, ICE doesn't use the term raid, it uses targeted enforcement. So like, if it is looking for somebody, a criminal alien that is released by a sanctuary, instead of turning it over, they're going to go out and conduct a targeted enforcement looking for that individual. So instead of doing those kinds of things regularly like they would have under previous administrations, instead they're also contributing to the same sorts of babysitting and rubber stamping that the Border Patrol and OFO have been involved in.
Great. Well, I think this is a great setup into your next slide, where you're kind of mapping out. It's kind of, game planning, you know, based on, the most perfect of all situations. This is what we could kind of expect in terms of volume for deportation. So I'll jump to that next slide now, Hart.
Excellent. Okay, so what I did here was I basically created a table of staffing availability. So there, in short, there are 365 days in a year, but there are only 240 work days. So that would be Monday through Friday, a customary work week. But there are 11, as I'm a federal employee, there are 11 federal holidays, and a federal employee on average will take 15 days of annual leave. It's how much leave you get is dependent on how long you work for the government. But so I wanted to reflect the fact that
Anywhere from
your
that week to
average.
1 month, right?
Yeah, so I went high end. I could have, been a little bit more stingy about it, but under this administration, people are taking the leave that they have because why not? You're not, if you're not going to do the job that the American people are expecting you to, then you might as well just, take your vacation instead. And then, of course, 13 days of sick leave. So I subtracted federal holidays, annual leave days, and sick days averaged out to that gets you from 240 days down to 197 days. So if we multiplied if we go to the next slide,
Okay.
we
Here
get
we
into
go.
the real math. Okay. So what I have here is yearly deportations by ICE. So this goes from FY 2009, which would have been the first year that President Obama was in office, all the way through FY 2020, which was the last full year that President Trump was in office. I would like to have done 2021, but the problem is that the Biden-Harris administration under Alejandro Mayorkas is extremely tight-fisted about releasing publicly what would normally be publicly available data. So I wanted everybody to be able to go to the same sorts of places that I went to. So
Okay.
I stopped at 2020. So
Right.
this gives you an idea of what our deportations looked like from that period of time. So the highest year was over 400,000 there, and there have been several years that were closer to it. We get to President Obama's second term, and he's already convinced people that he was hard on immigration. And so he gets reelected, and it sort of tapers off. And then it picks up a little bit in 2018 and 2019. And then, of course, come 2020, we have the pandemic. So let's go to the next slide.
Okay.
Okay, so this next slide is talking about who did the initial arrest. So in green, you have the Border Patrol, Customs and Border Protection. So primarily the Border Patrol, but not exclusively. And then in blue, you have ICE. So when we start talking about mass deportations, we need to be only talking about what's in blue, because
Right.
what's in green is literally a function. It's built in. So,
So yeah,
I
because if they're as you mentioned earlier, if they're found within 100 miles of the border or within the first couple weeks, they can be removed expeditiously. Correct.
exactly. So, I mean, this doesn't necessarily reflect what the Biden Harris administration has been doing, releasing people. But I mean, at the end of the day, each one of these people is an alien who was processed, who was not Canadian or Mexican, and needed to be detained long enough to obtain permission from their home country to travel, and in some cases, paperwork to do it. But so when we're talking about mass deportations, we need to be talking about bulking up those numbers in blue, because those numbers in blue are the arrests that ICE made themselves. So think of primarily interior arrests. So
Right.
these
That's what.
these lower numbers are not taking place along the border. They might be in the border area, in places like McAllen and El Paso, etc.
But
But
they're probably going to be Chicago, Philadelphia.
exactly. And so if we go to the next slide, now we're talking about criminals. And so a lot of what has been talked about on the campaign trail and by, the Biden Harris administration and candidate, now incoming President Trump, has been about prioritizing criminals. Now, this shows how many of those same aliens were actually criminals. And so if you look at the totals, the totals drop off. So now we're talking about people that ICE is arresting, in some cases, are only about 225,000 of aliens that might be deported in a given year. So, it's nice to say we're going to prioritize criminals. And I'm not I'm not saying that we shouldn't, but the problem is that the American people don't deserve to basically be victimized by people who shouldn't be here. So we
And,
shouldn't
and,
be
I, and I think that's a great point, Hart. I really think we should have our eye on the ball for 30 million. And I think the expectation from the administration that the American people should put on it is that we're going to see an awful lot of deportations, not the 1.5, 1.7 people who we know are criminals, but you know whether whether you just don't want to see bad behavior rewarded, or having the knowledge that all of these migrants, immigrants here in the United States are tearing at the social fabric. They're making it very difficult for, number one, our most vulnerable to access the social safety net that should be helping them through the hard times, and for our workers, our lesser skilled workers who, have finally started catching a break during COVID, only to find that now waves of migrants are being welcomed in, and they're competing for them for jobs.
Yeah, I mean that at the end of the day that needs to be a bigger consideration because I know so Congress asked ICE for information about what is known as the non-detained docket. And so that is basically aliens that are not in custody. And it was leaked intentionally by Republicans to show how many aliens are basically free, quote unquote, that are criminals. But what wasn't made clear to the American people and became like a misunderstood aspect is that most of those criminals weren't actually let into the country by the Biden-Harris administration, loath as I am to be seen as defending them. Those aliens, in a lot of cases, were already here. That's not to say people like the Ibarra brothers, who visibly came during this administration, don't exist, but is to
Right.
say when you're talking about millions of criminals on ICE's non-detained docket, they've been here in some cases for decades. And
Mm-hmm.
in some of the cases, they're not in ICE's custody, but they're in somebody else's. So ICE may have slapped a detainer on somebody saying, if you release this alien, we want to take custody of them. But if that person is in, like, let's say, a California prison
Mm-hmm.
for 40 years, if ICE has only been in existence since 2002. So if that was somebody that ICE slapped an early detainer on in 2003 and that person is doing a 40-year stretch, well, ICE doesn't have custody of that person and that alien, and they're not going to for quite some time. So people got upset. And it wasn't that it wasn't righteous indignation. It's that, again, they don't know any better. But
I'm
so for
really
us,
glad you took the time to explain that, Hart, because I think that's a really important point.
yeah, so, we can say we're going to prioritize criminals. And again, I think that that is worthwhile, but we can't exclusively do it in part because there aren't nearly enough of us to solely make a living on arresting criminal aliens. But we shouldn't have to wait until an alien that's deportable commits a crime in order for them to be a priority to us. So I would hope that the incoming Trump administration can say that they will prioritize, they will make arresting criminal aliens a priority, but they will not prioritize them over the ability to arrest any alien that an immigration officer comes into contact with who is deportable. And so if we go to the next slide
Great. Yeah,
here.
let's get into exactly that. Right. Here we go.
Okay,
This is,
so
wow.
looking back to those earlier slides, what we're talking about is a total of 3.6 million aliens that have been deported between fiscal year 2009 and fiscal year 2020. So 3,685,052. That comes out to a yearly average of 307,088 aliens deported per year. That, depending on who you are, that either sounds like a whole lot or not nearly enough. But
Well,
when
when
we
we're
start,
looking at 30 million, Not a whole
E-
lot.
exactly. So let's go to the next slide. So in 2018, Yale University and MIT jointly worked on a paper that was about estimating what the illegal alien population is. So the illegal alien population since the 1990s, roughly, has been estimated to be about 11 million. And, people for a long time have been like, well, that number can't be right. But and I'm not saying it is or isn't. I'm just going to give an explanation for it. So the whole thing about illegal aliens is, if you're an illegal alien who marries a U.S. citizen, then you're eligible for a green card. You might not be willing to actually get it if you were a border crosser, for instance, because in order to do that, you have to leave the United States. And if you leave the United States, you may be banned from returning to the United States anywhere from 3 years to permanently, depending on what your immigration offenses look like. So, but you do qualify because you're married an American citizen. The same thing for having a child that we regard as a U.S. citizen. So, an anchor baby, as people know it. If you have a baby in the United States and you manage to not get deported until that baby turns 21, the baby can sponsor you for a green card. So it's sort of the same thing as marrying a U.S. citizen. You may have to leave, but again, you still qualified. But, if let's say you decide to go home, especially if you're a visa overstay. So roughly about 800,000 aliens overstay in a given year. And that number has actually been increasing. So 800,000 is like the most recent. About 800,000 aliens overstay a visa a year. Now, some of them will later go home, but it doesn't change the fact that they overstayed. But so what I'm getting at is that the illegal alien population is sort of always in flux. So you'll always have people who are qualifying for green cards and then get it, and then later become U.S. citizens, die, return home, whatever the case may be. So that's how that 11 million figure has basically managed to exist for almost 3 decades. So what Yale and MIT sought out to do was try to figure out what the true illegal alien population was. And what they came up with was that it was probably at least double what the official estimate was. And then, so this graph here was actually taken from that study. And so this particular graph actually represents, they went out and looked for references to what the population was, and they created a band. So on the blue line is what the currently accepted population is, and so it starts out low estimate as 5 million in the 1990s, which would have been right after the 1986 amnesty.
Right.
And you see by 2000 it's already like about 10 million. And then in 2005, it's, what is that, like 13 million or so? And then there's a little bit of a decrease, but still just roughly 11 million. But then on the upper band, like the topmost line, would
Oops,
be
sorry.
a
There we go. Back at it.
would be a reference to somewhere closer to like 39 million people being here illegally. So I sort of joke the only way that we would ever know how many people are in the United States illegally would be to amnesty them. And I personally don't want to know that bad. I would much rather count them as they leave voluntarily or are deported. But that just goes to show, we're going to be talking here on the next slide about raw numbers. And so I used the upper band, the absolute highest figure in this Yale MIT study for the next slide. Okay, so as I said, the uppermost band from that study is approximately 39 million illegal aliens. So now, I don't have the ability to see the future, so I don't know who is going to run for the Republican Party in 2028, much less who is going to win it. All I know is that we have 4 years to deport as many illegal aliens in the United States as humanly possible. That is, according to the estimate, 39 million people. If we deported people at the same level as our average between FY29 and FY 2020, it would take us 127 years to do so. And that's assuming that there was not one more border crossing or visa overstay in that period of time. Just,
Okay, so tell me, Hart, how do we truncate that? How do we collapse that timeline?
well, let's go to the next slide.
All right, let me go ahead and bring up our slide here. And
Okay, so what I did was using the current staffing levels, now available positions, not again, without knowing how many of those positions are currently vacant. If the Trump administration said to the director, the assistant director for enforcement and removal operations, every one of your men and women that is a sworn officer is responsible for arresting one alien per workday per 197 days or more as part of being like for their satisfactory performance evaluation, let's say,
mm-hmm.
you must make one arrest per day. And it can be averaged out. You don't literally have to make an arrest a day. But 197 days you're theoretically available, and there are 6,000 of you, then that comes out to 1.1 million arrests in a year. And I already laid out on an earlier slide who gets due process and who doesn't. So if you're in the no due process column, like you're a visa waiver program overstay, or you're a prior deport, or you're subject to expedited removal, we don't add to the immigration court backlog at all. We can just simply detain those aliens long enough to get them travel documents and make travel arrangements, and they're out. Now, if we add HSI into it, now there's 6,500 special agents for HSI, and they customarily do not do immigration related work. But for this exercise, let's say that becomes a requirement for them as well, because actually HSI is responsible for worksite enforcements. That's not ERO, that's HSI. They're also responsible for student and exchange visitors. So if you come as a foreign student and you stop going to class, you're the program to monitor your compliance is run by HSI, not by ERO. So even though when HSI was created, it combined the plainclothes function of what was the legacy Immigration and Naturalization Service, along
Mm-hmm.
with U.S. Customs. And so a lot of the people that are now in senior level and leadership positions in HSI are legacy customs officers. They don't have familiarity, like historically, don't have familiarity with enforcement of immigration laws, and don't have an interest in doing it. They find it like beneath them. So they want to do sexy cases, but they don't necessarily want to do sexy cases that involve aliens because they
And
don't
I
want to have to arrest
love
them.
exactly because, you know, I worked in the federal government in the military for 11 years and learned very quickly people will do what they're incented to do. And if they can push away a job that they would prefer not to do, they will. But that's where, don't you think, you had mentioned an incentive structure? That's where there almost has to be a carrot and a stick, don't you think, Hart?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the people may be grossed out by that, like you're putting a bounty on them. No, I'm saying that I expect federal employees to do the entirety of their job, not pick and choose which parts they want to and don't want to enforce.
And
So,
my experience with government employees, that that their we call them efficiency reports, their personnel reports, uh, their reviews, that their bonuses depend on that, and that's kind of a big deal. So I think that is certainly the stick that can be used, and maybe there's another way for Congress to get involved and make a host of other incentives.
yeah, because I mean, even if we subtracted the bonus aspect of it and simply made it a performance standard in
Right.
order to be fully fully successful during your performance evaluation period, which is the fiscal year, then you must effect one arrest per workday, averaged out over, however many days it is that you work in during the fiscal year. Seems easy enough. I mean, there
That it
would be
does.
people that are
And
upset
these
by
would
it,
be
but
actual deportations and not simply arrests at the end of the
well,
day.
yeah, well, so it's kind of like comparing apples to oranges. Like, not everybody arrested is necessarily going to be immediately deported. But the whole thing is that if we aren't simply arresting criminal aliens and we start going after, like, the Anna Delveys, who, she signed away her rights to removal proceedings, so she never
Mhm.
should have been allowed to have them. So we start arresting those people. Those are easy metrics. Those are easy grounds to cover for somebody, if that is, a performance element for them to be fully successful for the year. Like, I don't care if an ICE officer arrests 197 visa waiver program overstays. I just care that they affected 197 arrests over
Okay.
the year. So,
Now,
some
go,
people are going to be good at one thing and some people might, be good at something else.
right. Also, too, are there ways to create, getting back to the carrot and the stick, for those who are here illegally, for them to to incent them to self-deport? Are there things that could? Uh, is it possible that there are statutes out there where there could be confiscations of property, of bank accounts, given, at the end of the day, if, let's just say, they were using a fraudulent social security number to work here in the United States, that would be a form of fraud, don't you think? That would,
It is,
so,
yeah. It is 100% an instance of fraud, and actually it's interesting that you picked that one because people are familiar with the 1986 amnesty, which
correct.
was sold to the American people, and even frankly within members of the House and the Senate, as what was supposed to be a one-time exercise. But what people don't know is that in the 1990 omnibus, and that should be a key right there, is that Congress actually included language that prohibited the prosecution of aliens that the government knew or later discovered had committed any form of Social Security fraud. So if you got amnesty from 1986, and there were smaller, like, add-on amnesties that still are part of the larger one, you were insulated from criminal prosecution for committing Social Security fraud, even if the government had you dead to rights. So, yes, if provided Congress understands that the American people, in fact, want mass deportations, and even, before the election, a simple majority of Americans said yes, they want illegal
Oh,
aliens deported.
interestingly enough, the Rasmussen polling uh, leading the 60 days up to the election, women, their for Democratic women, their top issue was abortion. But right below that was immigration, illegal immigration. And they heavily favored uh, deportation proceedings for those here illegally. So, I mean, it really is an issue that a lot of Americans are feeling very strongly about. So, absent Social Security fraud, are there other things that you think someone who is here illegally could be, other than being here illegally? What are some other things that they might be violations that they might typically have
Well, well,
created?
so provided an alien hasn't benefited from a work permit from this administration, an illegal alien, generally speaking, will commit a series of crimes related to obtaining employment. So it may or may not be Social Security fraud, but it may be lying on the Form I-9, the Employment Eligibility Verification Form.
Mm-hmm.
It might be stealing somebody's identity. It might be passing fake documents. There's all sorts of other crimes that we could get people for. And we could even go as simple as just simply the president instructing that we are going to actively enforce the what is known as the Alien Registration Act. And an aspect of the Alien Registration Act requires all aliens over the age of 18 to carry with them at all times on their person proof of registration. So, for instance, if you're a green card holder, your green card is your proof of registration, and you are required to carry it with you at all times. But if you're an illegal alien, chances are you don't have documents because you didn't register. But that's not the government's problem. And not having documents, not carrying them on you, is a crime. So there are all sorts of existing crimes in the current statutes that we could enforce. But yes, to your earlier question, we could do civil asset forfeiture of people. You like, in my career, I've only known, me personally, I've only known one illegal alien that did not need to work because that person was a billionaire. Everyone else has basically needed to work, whether that's working as a housekeeper in a hotel or starts a barbershop, whatever the case may be. Aliens come here for employment, and so they take on jobs. And of course, if you got smuggled here, you have an outstanding debt that you need to pay, and you pay that by working. So, we can do civil asset forfeiture. We could jam up aliens for failure to comply with the Alien Registration Act and carry documents. Aliens that have been, and this was actually something the Trump administration did the first time, was if you have been ordered deported and you do not leave, whether you refused or simply failed to deport, then you are actually subject to fines. And the fines begin accruing on the first day after you've been ordered deported. And they just continue to accrue. So the Trump administration, in a novel attempt to force illegal aliens to leave the United States, it started actually assessing fines. And these fines were like astronomical amounts. Like, the alien would never, ever be able to pay it. And that's fine with me. I don't care if they pay it. I only care that they leave because they were ordered to and didn't. But of course, the Trump administration succumbed to political pressure and criticism of, you're assessing these people these ridiculously high fines that they can never pay. And it relented, and it pulled back those fines. So it needs to revisit that. And this time, it doesn't matter about how mean it seems that they have assessed these fines and they expect them to be paid. Like, don't let up on them. Don't pull them back and make, returning to the US or obtaining a green card contingent on paying them. So, everything is, for an alien, is basically about winning the game.
Right.
So, I mentioned anchor babies. If you have a baby today and you manage not to get deported for 21 years, the day that child turns 21, they can sponsor you for a green card. You won the game at that point.
Right.
So if you can't get a green card because you owe the federal government $1 million, $2 million, and you can't have a green card until that's paid, and we're not going to waive that fine, oh well. I mean, the whole thing is, you received due process. You were given an opportunity to depart the United States as an adult of your own speed, your own volition, and you decided not to do it. Then it seems only fair that you should be subject to the maximum consequences that the law allows.
Great. Now, Hart, I'd like to talk to you about, certain things this Harris administration, Biden-Harris administration, has done that were, in a very dastardly way, but were also very novel approaches, where they took the CBP-1 app and just stuck it on steroids. So basically, someone who is inadmissible was literally able to arrive in the country at a port of entry and be granted access into the interior. And then we also have these TPS programs which are temporary protected status for Haitians, for instance, where they've been flying them in. And there's small cities like Springfield, Ohio, where 20 to 30,000 of them showed up in a city with a population of 55,000. How how can these the TPS, the parole programs that have been carried out by this administration be upturned and those people returned to their countries of origin?
Well, so they kind of overlap a little bit. The parole aspect is really easy. For starters, so the CBP1 app actually launched in October of 2020. So that was actually the Trump administration.
Right.
But back
But it was
then,
meant for very, it was supposed to be the exception to the rule. Like you're a
no,
truck driver.
yeah, exactly. That was it only had two functions back then. It was scheduling customs inspections, and if you were an alien that was admitted, you could have access to your immigration documents. That was it. So, starting in February of 2021, the Biden-Harris administration finds new and novel ways to use it. So, at first, it was verifying that Remain in Mexico participants, to the extent that there were any at that point, were enrolled. And then from there, it expanded to allowing NGOs to actually enroll people in Remain in Mexico, but it wasn't really doing a whole lot of that. Then I want to say in April of 2021 was the first of the parole program. So that would be Uniting for Ukraine, U4U. So that's where we get into the parole abuses. But parole is a discretionary benefit, and so it can be revoked, but it generally is going to lapse on its own. And so the nice thing about parole is that it's in entrance into the United States for a finite period and for what is supposed to be a specific purpose. And so what most Americans probably don't understand is that there is not actually a requirement to apply for asylum in these parole programs. So again, the Biden-Harris administration has very cynically convinced the American people, oh, well, we're letting these people in who are asylum seekers. Nope. Just simply is letting them in because they were more likely than not prospective border crossers, and they couldn't have continued illegal immigration between ports of entry at the levels that it had gone on. So, they now brag about how, crossings are lower now than when Trump left office. Technically true, but they're ignoring that even in the last 4 months of the last fiscal year, crossings were higher than all but 10 months of the Trump administration. And that 10th month is technically January of 2021. So only
Right.
3/4 of that month. But so Trump's overall numbers, even in his worst years, in most cases, were still better than this administration's. And also, they like to brag about, between 50 and 80% reduction in illegal crossings, but it ignores that there was a 251% increase from December 2020, Trump's last full month in office, and 2023 in December, which was the high water mark for the Biden-Harris administration. So yeah, they've reduced crossings by 80% after a 251%
Right.
increase.
Exactly.
But so now
we're stuck with all these immigrants now.
So
Are there
your TPS question. So TPS is a little bit more complicated because it has periods of coverage, and they're other than
are they by statute, Hart, or just
yes,
policy?
yeah,
Okay.
statute. So TPS is 8 USC 1254A, and so unless there's cause, and cause is criminality, unless there's cause, you cannot revoke TPS. Now, you cannot end it. You cannot renew it. You cannot redesignate it. It goes by a myriad of different names, but you can't simply take it away from an alien that has it. And this administration knew that. And that's why when President Trump was in office, we had, I think, six countries that have it, and now we're at like 19. And it was only a couple 100,000 people back then, and now it's like 2 million.
Mm-hmm.
So, the Trump administration tried to end TPS for Haiti, El Salvador, Nepal, a couple other countries, and they sued. But the level of, or the quality, if you will, of representation of the US government was not there. Because if you read the TPS statute,
Mm-hmm.
there is no judicial review. The people that had TPS could not sue because the Trump administration sought to end it. And so the Biden Harris administration ended up settling because the plaintiffs actually argued that the Trump administration did not have a Senate confirmed appointee um, running
Right, because
DHS.
Cuccinelli was not confirmed.
When
Was
yeah, Cuccinelli was not for USCIS,
Chad
but
Wolf?
uh, yes, and yeah, so basically they were winning on a technicality that DHS was not actually represented by somebody that had Senate confirmation, and rather than pressing, the
Right.
Biden Harris administration just settled.
Well, we've seen that time and again with this administration. I call it sue and settle. They just fold like a cheap tent when one of their proxies goes ahead and launches a lawsuit, and they're happy to, just settle. Uh, it's something for us to learn how to do. Those who want to restrict and better regulate our immigration system, and perhaps with this administration, there'll be plenty of opportunities to do just that.
Yeah, because DACA is actually a good example. So the state of Texas challenged the Obama
Right.
administration on DACA, and then during the transition to the Trump administration, they agreed to end their lawsuit, provided the Trump administration would end DACA. Now, it didn't actually end up ending DACA until September of 2017. So that's from January to September.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but then when it did, it again, like with TPS, it did not comply with the Administrative Procedure Act. And so the gamble from the White House was that um, the APA didn't need to be complied with because the Obama administration had violated it when it created DACA. And that was actually true. But the Supreme Court basically found that two wrongs don't make a right. And even though the Obama administration was wrong creating the program in violation of the Administrative Procedure Act, the Trump administration was wrong for ending it in violation of the Administrative Procedure Act. Now, it could have basically gone back and tried to end the program properly, something I personally encouraged from the outset. I called what was going to happen in September of 2017. I said, this is going to end this way, but that I was not in a position to influence that. But the Trump administration still could have gone back in the waning days of its administration and ended DACA again correctly. The Biden administration would have settled, but at least the groundwork would be laid. So hopefully on day one, this second Trump administration will end DACA once and for all if the Fifth Circuit doesn't do it first, which I'm kind of hoping happens because I would like to see the litigation, because the Supreme Court never actually said whether or not DACA was illegal. They said that was a decision for the Attorney General, who at the time was Jeff Sessions. So Jeff Sessions said it was illegal, and that was why we were going to end it. And so the Supreme Court just said whether or not it's illegal is, for the Attorney General to determine.
Right.
So,
Well, Hart, we're coming up on an hour and 45 minutes. One, for me, what I'm looking forward to, because the Trump administration has the executive branch, they'll have a majority in the legislature and a majority in the Senate. I'm looking forward to finding the looking at the emails, the documents of this administration, and trying to really get my head around their actual intentions. I mean, I have a lot of theories, but I want to know the kind of madness that had taken hold of them to think that uh, they could inject over 10 million people into the country and somehow that would be okay. And I'd love to know where the locus of decision making was on that. Was it with the executive, with Biden, or was it within the cabinet where Biden was too senile and Harris didn't know enough to do anything about it? Where did it all stem from? Because I think there needs ultimately to be an accounting for all of this. One of my happiest days for the last during this administration was when the Congress impeached Alejandro Mayorkas. I mean, if nothing else, he'll wear that impeachment like a scarlet letter for the rest of it, the remainder of his sorry life. I just want to. I just want to know exactly what they were thinking, and not what their intentions were, and then ultimately what their goals are.
Well, it pains me as an American to say that I think other Americans hate America, but that is basically what it boils down to. The people that represent the Biden-Harris administration hate America the way that you and I love it. They want to paraphrase, President Obama. They wanted to fundamentally transform America into something that was acceptable to them. So, in the debates, then candidate Biden basically talked about surging the border and asylum seekers, et cetera, et cetera. But, he's the chief executive. He wasn't actually making the day-to-day decisions. So it's my personal belief that we were supposed to see high, steady illegal immigration, but not at the levels that we ended up seeing. Like, you had basically partisan sycophants.
Oh my gosh, it was insane what happened. These were insane levels. And
yeah, so I think we were supposed to see like approximately, 100,000 people a month, for the 48 months. That's basically 4.8 million people. But the problem is that the same people that were left in charge at day to day, I think were actually stupid and incompetent. So they wanted like unacceptable but tolerable levels of illegal immigration, and they would break the immigration court system and basically say, we can't fix this. We have to have a mass amnesty.
And then it gets back to heart. Why? And again, like you said, and I think what you said first, early on in this last part of our conversation is spot on. I mean, these people really do hate America, but why? I mean, a lot of people might be ideologues in a way, but others, I think they think they could be, in the bind of some paymaster, a Soros, or someone like that, or these people pushing this globalist neoliberal agenda are like, we got to get rid of this American middle class. We got to get rid of their expectations for a middle class lifestyle and their guns and all that.
There's probably a lot of reasons. Everything from being able to police speech, all the way to just raw, naked political power. Because if you look at the 1986 amnesty, that basically is what caused California to turn blue. Now, arguments can be made using, this most recent election as an example, that the entirety of California is not in fact blue. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter because the population centers are. And the population centers are largely populated by people who either directly benefited from the 1986 amnesty or are the children or grandchildren of those people. So when I say raw, naked power, just imagine, almost 5 million people getting amnesty and then in 5 years being able to get like citizenship and be able to vote.
It's interesting. I was in D.C. and I caught an Uber lift, and that's how it's a good way to meet immigrants is take an Uber. And, this guy was going to be voting for his first time in this election, and he was from Ethiopia. And he really didn't know anything about either candidate. His litmus test was, who's going to be good for Ethiopia. And it's essentially having all these disenfranchised voters that, don't know, politically know their way to the outhouse here in America, and can be easily manipulated, as we've seen with what mainstream media has been able to do in terms of gaslighting people into thinking, somehow this is almost normal what's going on at the border and not to be outraged.
Yeah, but I mean, you also have, you know, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, originally from Somalia, campaigning in her native language and talking about how she represents Somalia. Well, she's a congresswoman from Minnesota. I'm reasonably certain she's supposed to be representing Minnesotans,
You
not
think?
Somalians. You could sort of draw a line between them that she represents Minnesotans of Somalian descent, but again, like Americans, not I represent Somalia. And that's exactly, I think, exactly to the point that you made about, the rideshare driver, is that we have basically allowed this pervasive way of thinking that you come to America and you're going to vote for somebody that has the interest of the place that you left in mind, when you frankly shouldn't really care about that place, at least not more than you care about what goes on here. And
And
that
that's
is
certainly something,
disconcerting.
yeah, we've learned from the first waves of immigration starting in the middle 1800s, lasting up into the early 1900s. Uh, the book to read is called Machine Made. It's about the Tammany Hall gang in New York City. And, the Irish, I'm Irish. My mother was born and raised on a small dairy farm in Ireland. But the Irish herald in a level of political corruption absolutely unseen in North America before that. And it's continued to this day. I mean, your moniker, Hart and Cellar, both came out of that Tammany Hall ooze. And the priority was to overturn the Immigration Act of 1924, which was highly restrictive and very regulated, and increase the number of immigrants with the 1965 Immigration Act. So, yeah, I mean, it's immigration. We've learned that period between 1924 and 1965. It works best when it's restrictive, rare, even, and well regulated. And right now, we have nothing close to that. And it's, we're in the process, along with other things like offshoring and outsourcing, we're destroying the middle class here in America.
Yeah, and it's really difficult to say that I think that that's by accident, because I would be lying to myself and
Right.
everybody listening. There's why, whether or not it's actual malice, or it's just uh, you know neglect or misunderstanding. I mean, Ted Kennedy basically said at the time that the 1965 Act was being debated that that bill would not change the makeup of the United States, that we would not be letting in masses of people. And in the end, that is quite literally exactly what happened.
And I
Everything that
have
he
to
said.
believe the framers knew that that would be a consequence.
Yeah, I'm hard pressed to say that they didn't. But the problem is that there have been critics of it since the day after it passed, yet not enough to actually do anything about it, because we might hurt somebody's feelings.
Right. And, we're going to, it's, I'm hoping that it's not too late to fix this problem and get the country back on the right track. And, we'll see. Hopefully, hey, maybe in 4 or 6 years, I'll get to close down this shop. We'll declare victory, and I'll go off into retirement at that point. So,
That that would be fantastic. But I mean, in the meantime, we talked about how many aliens ERO and HSI could potentially deport in a year, and we
let
talked
me
about
bring up that
how.
slide again for our audience.
Okay.
There it is.
Okay, so if each officer and agent only affected one arrest per workday, and then theoretically that person was actually deported, that's 2.4 million aliens in a single year. If we up that to 5 arrests per year, that's 12.3 million aliens. And so if we think back to the high band estimate from Yale and MIT, if we
Mm-hmm.
have 39 million illegal aliens, you know, notwithstanding due process considerations,
Right.
staffing issues, and of course funding for detention beds and flights, which aren't free, we could potentially go from 127 years to being able to deport the entire illegal alien population in under 4. So
Yes.
we could do mass deportations. We would just have to lean into it and not give in to emotional blackmail associated with crying women and children.
Oh, absolutely.
If
Because they're going to have the photos of the children being, apprehended and pulled away from their parents. You can bet that will happen. But I'm hoping, what if nothing else? One of the things this election, not nothing else, but one of the things this election demonstrated was the mainstream media that's been responsible for this level of gaslighting. It's not nearly as effective as it used to be. And this medium, this podcast, that once I edit it and get it up, that's the way of the future. I mean, we're reaching as many people probably as as MSNBC these days.
Excellent. That is excellent. I look forward to, everybody watching it going, hey, wait, I was told that these people were asylum seekers and we have to let them in for asylum processing. And instead reaching out to, the incoming Trump Vance administration and saying, hey, you campaigned on mass deportations. And, I watched this podcast with these two dudes where they basically told me that the vast majority of people that are coming can be deported without referral to an immigration judge. I want that. That's what I voted
Yeah,
for.
we want
Do
option
that
C.
thing.
Thank you very
Yeah.
much. Yes. Well, Hart, stick around because I'm going to do my quick closeout here. But I want to thank you so much, Hart, for joining me today. I know my audience is going to love this. I'm going to probably get it up within the next 2 hours. I think it's that important. And and for my audience, wow. I want to thank you all for sticking with us through this 2 hours. If you enjoyed this and want to see more of it, do two things, please. If you're watching on X, be sure to give it a love and retweet it. Also, if you're watching this on YouTube, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe. That way, you're notified on for future podcasts, and it certainly helps with our algorithm. And again, be sure to share that as well. And for those wanting more, please visit our website at www.instituteforsoundpublicpolicy.org. All of our social media platforms are there at the bottom of the page. All of our posts, all of our videos. You can find some great content there. And hey, if you do like this and you want to support our mission of pushing back against bad immigration policy, and as I've been told, we not only are we the most based organization on social media in this movement, we might also be one of the more effective ones out there in garnering public opinion. So go to that donate button, hit that, and show us some love there. It's always appreciated. Again, thank you so much. And I will also put Hart's social media information on this at the bottom in the comments, so you'll find that as well. Kevin Lynn, Executive Director of the Institute for Sound Public Policy, signing out. And again, thank you all, and be safe out there. We're coming on with will be a pretty turbulent next several years in this country, and I think we're finally back on a good track, but it's going to take all of us pulling together and sticking through it. All right, have a good night.